Good morning, everyone, or good day, wherever you are. We're just waiting for people to come in. Just give us a few minutes here and we'll get started as people start to come into the room. All right, for those of you that are coming into the room, we're just going to wait a minute or two, make sure everyone's here, and then we'll get started.
Sounds good, Azita. And also, I'll just make note quick, as luck would have it, I'm having some thunderstorms roll through right now. So please let me know if you see any interference or static.
Absolutely.
I'll try to optimize my connection if it's impacted.
No problem. Awesome. So we'll get started in a minute here. So hi, everyone. Welcome to the Online Ethics Center's Spring of 2024 webinar series, Bringing Ethics to the Conversation. My name is Azita Hirsa, and I'm a teaching professor at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute School of Engineering, Industrial Systems Engineering Department, where I teach courses in management of engineering and technology, ethics of modeling, engineering ethics and professional development, technical issues and solutions. I'm the chair of the Ethics Division at the American Society of Engineering Education, ASEE, and thrilled to be the webinar host for OEC's 2023-24 season. The Online Ethics Center, hosted at the University of Virginia, is a digital repository for resources on teaching and learning about ethics in engineering and science. The OEC also fosters a community of faculty, students, researchers, and other professionals who come together to discuss ethics. Please check out our website at onlineethics.org. The theme of our fall and spring webinar series is Engineering Ethics in Industry. I'm delighted to host our speaker today, Mr. Marc Roman. Marc Roman is responsible for managing the security control frameworks necessary to address and mitigate information security risks for CMA's corporate and the NYSDOH Medicaid Data Warehouse project. Mr. Roman joined CMA in 2014 and brings with him nearly 30 years of functional and managerial IT experience from both commercial and government ecosystems, all of which is used to ensure the success and security of CMA and its clients. Marc has served with many diverse security, compliance, infrastructure, and systems-based integration teams throughout his career, and he's skilled with advising on many of the tort panel and regulatory legal considerations associated with the modern day data privacy, healthcare, and cybersecurity landscape. Mr. Roman received his Bachelor's of Art from the State University of New York at Albany and his Juris Doctor from Albany Law School. In addition, he currently holds ITIL, COBIT, CISA, CRISC, CISSP, CIPP, and CDPSE certifications. After Mr. Roman's talk, we will take questions. To ask a question, please type in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen rather than the chat box, and I'll read it to him. Audience members will not be able to use their mics or cameras. So thank you so much, Marc, for being here. I'll pass the mic on to you, and yeah, we'll get going.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you, Azita. What a wonderful introduction. Happy to join the group today, and I think the mission of the Online Ethics Center is a wonderful, wonderful thing. These days, I think we certainly could use more reminders in industry and certainly within cybersecurity, compliance, audit, and law about some of the ethical dilemmas that we do run into from time to time, day to day, frankly. There's continual reminders about where we need to be with our ethical behavior from a professional and personal perspective. So I do have a background significant in cybersecurity, IT. Frankly, when I went to law school, I focused on cybersecurity and issues relating to privacy, confidentiality, of course. And certainly with the work that I'm doing now and over the last 10, 15 years or so, I would say, it's become even that much more important with the more sensitive issues related to healthcare information, banking information, and otherwise any kind of personal, private, or sensitive data. So definitely very timely, very topical, and certainly with the breach environment that we see right now, unfortunately, in the consumer market. These are wonderful topics to address to try to minimize any of this from happening, and if it does, to minimize the impacts of what's happening. So I have a slide deck I'm going to fire up here, and let's see if I can get this appropriately up. Let's see here, share. Okay, I'm sharing my screen. Everybody see that?
Yes, we can. Yep.
Excellent. Okay. Okay, so again, my talk, I'm just considering this 2024 professional ethics. I usually tend to date delimit my presentations only because things do change very rapidly within the law. There are privacy statutes being essentially proposed and even passed across the nation at this point in the United States from the domestic context. But internationally speaking, there were a variety of different statutes. Frankly, from Canada to Mexico and down to South America, there are numerous privacy statutes. All of them have an ethics component. And Europe, of course, we've all heard about the GDPR and all of the different requirements for social networking companies to have to adhere to. China, APEC, that's a whole different area in and of itself. Here, I'm focusing 2024 professional ethics. I'm focusing on domestic or CONUS type work, so contiguous United States. And my subject matter today will have to do with cybersecurity, compliance, audit, and law. Of course, I can't fit in too much within the window of time here. I'll go fairly quickly, and I'm assuming the deck will be available to the attendees afterward for further reference. And certainly feel free to contact me if you have any questions that we don't get to today. So the first slide I have, I wanted to just talk quick. I don't know if everyone has seen this movie, but it's a movie called Wall Street. And there's a clip I wanted to play. I think, Azita, you may be able to help me with this. So let me stop my share. Okay, and let's just play this quick clip if we can.
Morning, Chuck. Morning, Lou. Bud. But I like you. Just remember something. Looks like this, but nothing staring back at him. That moment, man, just character. What keeps him out of the abyss.
Okay. Wonderful. Wonderful. Okay. I hope everybody got to hear that. It's, if you've seen the movie, you know, the movie Wall Street has to do with essentially ethical dilemmas in the financial world on Wall Street. So I'm resharing now at that slide. At that moment in this clip, the person Hal Holbrook is talking to, the Bud Fox character, is being essentially walked into his office to be arrested by the SEC because Bud Fox, excuse me, has made some bad decisions with regard to insider trading while he's working as a stockbroker. And I can say for a fact, the stockbroker ethics, I've been a licensed stockbroker, mutual fund distributor, annuity provider, a bond seller. I've done that work as well as part of my prior career. The ethics that are required of that role are very high. And you'll hear, you know, from time to time, there'll be SEC crackdowns or the Securities Exchange Commission. In this movie, he's being pulled aside by his boss, Hal Holbrook's character. And he's saying at this point, a man looks into the abyss. And at that point, a man finds his character, and that's what saves him from the abyss. I thought it was just germane in a sense because we talk about a man finds his character. Well, what is his character? it's related to his ethical beliefs, you know, in a lot of ways. So in this case, did Bud Fox use ethics in a way that served him personally, served his business, served his company, or was it strictly just for personal gain and transgressing the law, stepping all over other people, destroying some people's lives? Character versus ethics. Is there really a difference? Well, we'll talk about that. And as we go through the presentation, there'll be different points where we can see how that matters. Okay. So just quickly, I'm not going to read through all the text in my slides, but just a level set. And this crowd certainly is familiar with ethics. I wanted to provide more of a legal definition with regard to Black's Law Dictionary, which of course is sort of the go-to for most attorneys. Just to highlight the high points from an ethical standpoint, we're talking about the ideals. How do we want to behave? Human conduct, human character. It's a system of moral tenets and principles. Now we're going to get into some of the ways that this can vary. However, this is typically what we refer to when we talk with ethics in the legal sphere. And I'll tell you that will also roll into any of the professional areas that I'm talking about: cybersecurity, compliance, audit, certainly law. Okay. We get into this question of moral right and wrong. Okay. And obviously that can vary. That can vary based on the participant, based on the culture, based on the timing of something happening or not happening. Behavioral standards. Okay, this is you almost want to picture that that movie where, you know, somebody's got a little devil on one shoulder and a little angel on the other, you know, and they're kind of vying for attention. What's right and wrong? What are my behavioral standards? What do I need to do here? Okay. So that's kind of the legal definition. And getting into a little bit more extrapolation, and this is for some of the more diehard ethics fans here, but I just wanted to talk about these different forms of ethics that we could easily identify. Objective ethics, okay, that's basically got absolute boundaries. This is right, this is wrong. And as I put in the example, somebody who absolutely believes in nonviolence would consider it wrong to use violence at all. You might call them a pacifist today. There's no way of justifying any violence in this person's mind, right? And so this has its limitations. There are pros and cons to this, and it's very difficult to actually keep an objective ethics approach in some of the industries with certain situations and certain decisions. It's not to say that that's a bad thing. Obviously, I'm not talking about violence in the case of a company or a professional decision, as much as I'm talking about disclosure. I'm talking about things like documentation, working with third parties. How do you deal with them? What is your normal approach to that? And how do you view yourself as in doing that? I'm sorry, I'm going to have a sip of water here. So we have the objective ethics or the absolutism part of it. Then we have situational ethics. I see this a lot, not only in legal cases, litigation, and in professional discussions between companies, B2B, business to business type things, or business to regulators. Situational ethics is based on this. Well, this is my belief. Let's say, as I put here, the murder is wrong, but you can make an exception for self-defense or war or something like that. Right. So now we're shifting a little bit. It's not absolute. It's, well, I believe this, but other decisions that might result in that could be justified. Okay. So situational ethics. Right. So now that kind of takes us into the next thought of subjective ethics. There's no absolute, there's no constant. You know, ethical relativism, you know, this is where things start, in my view, to get into a little bit of a slippery slope. Because if you don't actually have a reference, if you don't have a guiding light in the way you're going to decide how to act or behave, or have your company act or behave, then, you know, you could make a decision that's a justification into an unethical area. And if you start going down that with enough justifications, you may wind up at a destination you didn't predict. Okay, so subjective ethics. That's the most flexible, sort of undefined area. And yet we would still call them ethics, interestingly enough, right? Virtue ethics is interesting. That's where it's sort of innate. If you're a good person, it's about your character. Now we're talking about Bud Fox again in Wall Street. If he's a good person, he should be doing good things. Again, what are we defining as good? That could be based on absolutism. It's based on my religious beliefs, or it's based on my code of conduct, or something to that degree. But to be good, you must do good things. I don't know if Bud Fox thought he was doing something good by making money. And so it depends on where your parameters are and what your goals are. And frankly, virtue ethics normally works for most of us in terms of a day-to-day. But in a corporate environment or a professional environment or even an academic environment, there may be times where there's a tension between your personal virtue ethics and institutional ethics, which you might call absolutist ethics, right? Based on the creed of the school, business, whatever it might be, law, for instance. Okay. So that's pretty much most of the detail I wanted to get into in terms of the backdrop of ethics, in terms of a defined approach. What I'm sharing here is an example of cybersecurity ethics. And I don't want to go through this word for word, but what I want to point out is these are the types of things that are enforced for members of the ISC squared. And it's kind of a long name here. It's the International Information System Security Certification Consortium, ISC squared. So basically what they're known for are certifying people. These are test-based certifications. You actually take an exam and then they award you a certification in the area of your specialty. So they are a classic certification. I have the one that's known as the CISSP, considered one of the more mature cybersecurity certifications out there. And this one is a good example of a typical code of conduct or a code of ethics that I now need to adhere to as part of being a member of ISC squared and as part of retaining my certification. Okay, so just generally speaking, we adhere to the highest ethical standards of behavior. Interesting, right? Because as we talked about just before here a few minutes ago, to which measurement am I talking about? I mean, is it an objective standard? I'm not sure they're providing much guidance there. There's more detail, but I just want to show that this is kind of almost a vague concept. However, they do go on here. And of course, condition of certification. So they could pull my certification if there's a complaint or they find that I'm not adhering to the code. So these are going to be common. You're going to see a lot of these throughout the cybersecurity, compliance, and audit type professions. Protect society, the common good, necessary public trust, confidence in the infrastructure. So now I have a duty to essentially help people and protect those IT assets that I work on. I also have a duty to my company, and essentially that's provide diligent and competent service to principals. My company, that's my principal client. In fact, from a legal perspective, as an attorney, the company that I work for as an attorney is my client. And of course, under my attorney ethics, I'm supposed to just zealously advocate the best possible outcome for my client. It might be my company in this case, if I'm more of an internal counsel. But the common good, necessary public trust, confidence, and the infrastructure. This becomes a very big deal right now when you talk about federal government approaches through the CISA, critical infrastructure discussions, and NIST with regard to their frameworks. They all are advocating common good, necessary public trust, but really actually even the defense of the nation. So when you're talking about cybersecurity now, if you're in a role that's more leadership oriented, and that's the Chief Information Security Officer for CMA, and then for some of the clients that I work for, the New York State Department of Health, for instance, I have an obligation to protect them, their data, and essentially their principles, which really does boil down to all of the particular people that they have data for. So it's quite vast. advance and protect the protection. And again, I don't want to present myself in a way that leads to skepticism or doubt, or have any introduce any kind of concern about the way that I'm managing data. Trust is really the key, and it's not just this public trust, it's trust between my organizations, the people that I work to protect, and then good faith efforts to always propagate a sense of control and adherence, and basically reasonable efforts in all areas. Okay, so that's the ISC squared for cybersecurity. I also have a privacy certification. I've studied privacy for many years. I teach on privacy at Albany Law School, and I developed the coursework there for their graduate studies program for those areas, the initial areas we did 5-6 years ago now. So there's a certification that you can get. It's the Certified Information Privacy Professional. It's a company called IAP, and they actually have some great materials as far as ethics are concerned. But again, I just wanted to show the same similarities here. So courtesy, honesty, and integrity. You'll work honestly. You will have the skills, knowledge, and competence to do your job. That actually overlays with a lot of legal tenets. Frankly, as an attorney, I shouldn't take your case or represent you in court if I don't feel that I have the competency to do that. So my ethics, from a virtue ethics standpoint, I'm going to, of course, be disinclined to take a case that I don't have great experience on. But from a professional standpoint, I could be referred to the disciplinary committee in New York State or any other state that I'm licensed in, if in fact I was not able to represent my client effectively. And we've all heard about that sort of ineffective assistance of counsel with regard to a defense a client might have against a verdict. So skills, knowledge, and competence. This becomes important. Ethically, you need to have that before you take on the role, okay? You don't want to represent their certification in a misleading way or use their certification in a way that might cause them some sort of disrepute. Well, frankly, that's going to apply also to any company I work for or that you work for. You really don't want to bring your company into a sense of tension of, right or wrong. Is the company behaving incorrectly or questionably? Now, that's not to say that you can't handle things internally. And, there are whistleblower programs and things like that to try to report ethical concerns to management or executive management. But, you would keep that undercover internally while you're dealing with that and try to resolve it that way prior to putting something on your social media about your company or an organization or a school or something, speaking in a way that might seem authoritative. That could be risky, and bringing that organization into disrepute could bring a lot of negativity your way in terms of defending that. So you need to maintain your professional knowledge and competence. We're back to competency. Yep, have to do that. And of course, they also have certification policies, procedures, guidelines, and requirements. Every company will, every school will. I reviewed the code of conduct at RPI prior to this. UV, of course, has their own code of conduct. Every organization will and is, I believe, required to have such a structure in place to be able to provide that guidance. As you've heard with legal issues from time to time, if you don't know the law, ignorance is really no excuse. However, I will say that if you're not getting into a willful sort of disregard and it's just ignorance, a lot of times there will be less of a penalty. I'll talk about that in a little bit when we talk about HIPAA fines and penalties. However, point being is full disclosure, people need information, they need references to these policies and procedures, and to some degree, they need training on it as well. We want people to act in concert to the same goal. And this becomes more of a governance concern for executive management or executive leadership over time. Okay, so that's IAP, that's the privacy. This one, I know this slide is really busy. I apologize for that. You could look at this online if there was any desire to. ISACA is another very popular company to provide certifications. They do a lot of compliance work now. So we talked about cybersecurity, we talked about privacy, I'm talking about compliance ethics here. Where you're going to see this roll in, of course, will be with regard to compliance assessments in your company or organization, including audit. And audit, of course, they're big into the AICPA. They get into licensing CPAs, accountancies, and those firms that do sort of financial statement certifications, internal controls over financial reporting. Okay, so the ISACA group is sort of quasi-related to AICPA, but certainly as I have a CISA certification, a Certified Information Security Auditor, degree certification, I have to abide by these standards as well. So what are we dealing here? It's a little bit different. There's more than just cybersecurity or privacy. Governance, they're talking about due diligence here. These are ethical concerns. Are you doing the job the way you need to do? Are you professional enough to be able to attention to detail, communication, okay, documentation? You need communication really. I don't want to underestimate that at all. In fact, I don't know that I could overestimate the importance of communication. Good communication is not only the key to working with effective teams, okay, but it's also very helpful in being able to convey concepts to either executive management or staff level jobs where you need to convey concepts, ideas. So being able to use professional care to convey issues before things blow up, before things get out of your hands and they get to that sort of more executive level for review. Very helpful. Communication is key. In fact, as you go to law school and you go through that, you realize you have to write. I mean, you have to write and you have to learn the nuances of grammatical content, and words matter. So being able to use your language to communicate either orally or in writing, very important. You need to be able to provide that give and take communication in a lawful manner. Okay, I guess we could have guessed that, of course. Privacy and confidentiality. Okay, definitely. That's an overlap with the privacy and cybersecurity areas. Maintain competency. Yeah, I need to keep up with what's going on in the field. Inform appropriate parties of the work performed, including the disclosure of all significant facts. Well, that's sometimes a harder job than it sounds like. That's where I need to give people bad news sometimes, or inform management that something's not working correctly. I can't just give them the good news and say, well, they didn't ask me about that other thing. That's kind of falling apart in the background, but they didn't ask me, so I don't need. No, I need to be proactively disclosing issues that could affect either my team, my management team, the executive, the company, or any of the third parties that we work with from the perspective of our day-to-day or our overarching governance goals. Okay, so again, we're talking about ethical considerations here. Virtue ethics, am I going to do the right thing? Do I have, the angel and the devil on my shoulder? Well, don't tell him that because it's going to sound bad. Well, you really should tell him though, because if he gets caught flat-footed on that, it's going to be a surprise and it might look bad for everybody. It's those tensions, and this is where we're talking about professional ethics. If you do the right thing, every time, and that can vary in scope, but if you always try to do the right thing, basically you're going to be considered ethically compliant, honesty, and people will trust you. All right, professional education of stakeholders, of course, more communication. I'm going to move out of some of this stuff. There is one more code I wanted to just bring up quick. I'll leave it in here for reference. You can see this is an older code. This actually, the ACM code was more of a general computing code that came out, I believe, in the late 90s. And you can see some of those buzzwords here: honesty, avoid harm, trustworthiness, be fair, privacy, confidentiality. That's the common theme. So again, if I'm talking about cybersecurity, privacy, audit, compliance, they really have that same thread through. And I'm gonna say, well, I'm not familiar with all of the engineering disciplines, that there are probably very similar types of approaches with regard to, say, structural engineering or architecture or any of these other science-based, sort of hands-on engineering type skills. Well, frankly, chemical engineering, non-destructive testing. If you think back to the shuttle disaster with the O-rings that gave out improperly, what are the ethics having to do with testing those? Is it just what I think I need to do, to check the box? Or should I be proactive and start thinking about, well, I don't know, this could actually be a problem because maybe they've been on the shelf for 3 years. Maybe they've aged out. I don't know. Maybe we should test that. Maybe you have to go beyond the specific requirement if you have a feeling that there could be an impact. So again, good faith and reasonableness. Okay. Code of conduct violations. So this is where we're just talking about not adhering to essentially a code of ethics. And this can take multiple forms. I'm just talking about a few here quick. Academic dishonesty. So as a student, you have a requirement to try to honestly and effectively go through your program without cheating or plagiarizing and things like that. We all sort of know that, right? But it does get a little bit gray right now. I know that the schools I've worked with, including Albany Law School, we've had major discussions about the use of AI now in student papers and student discussions. And while it's a very effective tool for certain things, we obviously don't want students to be creating papers and submitting them as their own work based on that type of technology. This is where it's, what is the ethical dilemma here? Using the tool, but then actually creating your own scholarship, your own scholastic material. Workplace misconduct. Well, sure, this is obviously the classic, sexual harassment, discrimination, theft of resources, theft of time, misrepresenting time logging. These are violating any number of policies, procedures, standards, guidelines, code of ethics. And then these professional ethics breaches. That's what I was talking about with the earlier ISC squared, ISACA, IAP, those type, the ACM, those are professional ethics codes. And what they can essentially do is strip you of your certification. There's really no legal recourse, but you essentially will be excommunicated from that group, that community. And a lot of those certifications are required for certain types of employment. So that's a negative there as well. Okay, I just want to talk quick, moving gears here to some penalties. Now, it's to say that there are some things that, unlike code of conduct violations, there are things that go dramatically against regulatory requirements. This is the Bud Fox problem. Insider trading, from the SEC's perspective, is punishable by, it's a criminal act, and it's punishable by either fine, imprisonment, or both, including potentially the removal of a company's license to actually perform their duties that they've been created for. If you lose your broker license, you can't trade anymore, and that will destroy a company. In this case, I'm showing Ernst & Young. Just a quick reminder about some of the scale here. This was back in basically 2022 when this was reported. $100 million fine after the auditors cheated on ethics exams. So this is really not good. We trust these auditors. They come in, and we disclose a lot of information. There's a couple of people you talk to, quite frankly, in terms of your disclosure of information. Normally it's your attorney, your doctor. Traditionally in the law, there's also a priest penitent exception in terms of privilege. But your auditor, you talk to your auditor about a lot of things, typically your bottom line, your expenses, your income, all of the different things you're worried about. So here you've got auditors now where you believe that they have the highest sort of levels of ethical conduct expected of them, and they were found cheating. This is a black eye for the entire industry when this happens, because then people don't know what to believe. Big auditing firm Ernst & Young, regulators found they misled investigators, all right, withheld evidence, violated public accounting rules. This is not good. And you can see they got tagged accordingly with this major fine. And of course, the reputational damage, very difficult to reclaim and very expensive, frankly. And they probably lost numerous clients as a result of this. So the irony here, of course, is that they were cheating on ethics exam requirements. They need to keep up their annual ethics, training. And here they were cheating on that. So boy, it doesn't get much more more in the face of an ethical violation than cheating on ethics requirements. All right, so that's an Ernst & Young example. I have one more here. I'm showing Wells Fargo. This was a couple years ago. $3 billion fine. The agents, I should say, the staff in the company, they actually created fake accounts over time, and they were trying to essentially misrepresent the amount of sales activity they were doing because, and this is an interesting thought here, driven by wildly unrealistic sales goals. All right, and the executives themselves shifted the blame to the individuals and not the sales model with the unrealistic sales goals. Arguably, it's about the individual, right? So I might have an unrealistic sales goal that's really onerous and adversarial, let's say, but I guess I'm making that choice, right? And I have to be very cautious. If I'm going to misrepresent something, the accountability sort of ends with me. I'm making that assertion. I'm the one that's putting my trust on the line, my word, my reputation individually. We're talking about virtue ethics again in this case, right? And I don't know what the executives were doing, prospectively to avoid this. If there was any kind of sanity check or checks and balances to make sure these accounts were actually real, but apparently the top managers of this bank, Wells Fargo, were aware of these unlawful and unethical practices for many, many years. At least, it sounds like at least about 16 to 18 years. Again, how does a company recover from that? I mean, Wells Fargo is still in business. I've dealt with them in the past, and of course, the people I've dealt with, I have no reason to believe were unethical. But boy, it gives you that sense of skepticism when you're dealing with them, and it affects their name and their institutional credibility. Okay, moving quickly here, I'm going to go into HIPAA violations only because HIPAA violations in and of themselves aren't an ethical breach, but there are different levels of negligence that have to adhere based on how data was disclosed inappropriately. So this is, again, the United States Department of Health and Human Services. This is federal now. HIPAA is a federal statute. And the fines are potentially very significant. Here's the key. As I was talking about earlier, you can have a breach resulting from ignorance, all right? Or it could be you were acting reasonably, but it still happened, or willful neglect. Now, willful neglect, now we're talking about decisions. We're talking about, I know that data is not protected, but I'm going to share it this way anyway, and it gets breached. Well, that's much different than, gosh, I didn't even know that file was there, and boy, I feel really bad about that. Willful neglect's much different. In the law, we talk about negligence. Basic negligence is usually not intentional, but certainly when you get into recklessness, now you're talking about making decisions with knowledge, and it results in a bad outcome. So here we have these HIPAA violations. And you can see the difference in penalties that they assess. So if you make decisions based on your internal sense of code of conduct or company's code of conduct or your own virtue ethics, if I go into willful negligence, you can see it's a logarithmic increase in potential fines. All right, if they find that breach data was as a result of your willful neglect, all right, you could be looking at over $2 million per per event where a number of let's say electronic health records were disclosed inappropriately. So that's the only reason I wanted to call this out, is that even from a regulatory enforcement standpoint, from the government and HHS or OCR, Office of Civil Rights, they actually will do penalty scoring based on how they find you acted. And that's something we can try to control, right? Our actions, our decisions. All right. So I want to talk a little bit about moving forward. Business ethics, this is a general approach. This does not just apply to cybersecurity, compliance, and privacy, audit, and the law, but certainly that's all part of this as well. What are the trends? Well, customers feel better about dealing with companies that have a strong ethical code. Okay, that'll give them a better sense of confidence and trust. All right, and ethical leadership improvements. You may have those types of trainings now introduced to the executive layer that have more to do with ethics, and we're not dealing necessarily with subjective ethics. They'll have a more absolute, these are our behaviors, these are how we are going to behave, these things are things we have to do: honesty, integrity, transparency. Okay, winning over stakeholders, customers, and staff. Sure, it's another selling point for your company or your institution. I think everybody would welcome transparency, objectivity, that type of thing in any company that they're dealing with. Certainly a high level of attention to the protection of the customer's money or data or level of service. We all kind of appreciate that. And flexibility in adjusting ethically to innovation and technology. I'll talk about this a little bit more in the end, but as new things happen and new technologies are developed, like AI, let's say, how does a company adapt to that? How do we apply those ethical standards to this new technology? Okay. These are sort of the trends, as you might have guessed. I just wanted to make sure it was here in the slide for future reference and talk about it for a few minutes, because these are very dynamic areas right now. But at the same time, we're still talking about individual decisions, corporate governance. We're talking about the same type of approach to handle new situations. And the things that are happening now, of course, have to do with use of personal information, misinformation, deep fakes, oversight and acceptance of responsibility, use of AI and autonomous technology. And by autonomous technology, I mean those types of things that can work from an automation standpoint that basically are guided by your configuration, but that take actions without your deliberate sort of execution. We've all heard of self-driving cars, for instance. That's an example of autonomous technology where it's the actual device now that's taking action based on instruction, but coded in such a way that it could reflect the intentions of the engineers, okay, the goals of the engineers. So there's a way to build in or assert ethics in the technology that's embedded in that as well. Okay, these emerging ethical dilemmas in science and tech. I talk a little bit more about some other areas here. Big one in, of course, healthcare industry, health tracking, status of people in sort of health networks. There's attempts by local governments, local, state, federal governments to try to predict when people or demographic groups are going to have issues, what type of issues and how expensive that might be. So there's health tracking, but there's also this digital twin dilemma where they try to essentially accumulate as much information as they can to try to predict what your behavior is going to be. So at what point does that become an ethical concern? Is it possible for them to ultimately create a decision tree that reflects the way you think? And then what does that mean ethically? Should they be exploiting that? Is that actually something you have a personal interest in from an intellectual property standpoint? Is that a privacy concern? Things to think about with this digital twin and the health tracking issues. It's actually quite fascinating when you dig into it a bit. Neurotechnology and privacy, sure, same kind of approach. Are there ways to augment people? There's this transhumanistic approach to how can I make the human decision-making processes or information retention, how can I optimize that? Is it, drugs or supplements, or is it an actual physical thing such as a chip or some sort of stimulant device that actually affects different areas of the brain? Interesting. And ethically, there are a lot of bioethics questions about this. The legal standpoint, of course, has to do with more bioethics, privacy. What is your body? Do you own your body? That type of thing. It's an interesting question. I remember going through some of this from a privacy perspective. You know, what happens to your body when you you know, when you have an operation and they remove something, you know, is that still you? Is that yours, or is it theirs now? These are bioethics questions, and it kind of dovetails into this neurotech and privacy. All right, genetic engineering, that's been a common discussion now for many decades. Of course, here we're talking about the editing of the human genome and things like that to avoid, ostensibly to avoid disease or deficiencies, you know, structurally, let's say in people, or even somebody who's fully functional. You know, are there ways to affect your body in a way that's considered positive? There sure are many approaches to that right now. Ethical dilemmas. How far do we want to go? Who's taking accountability for that? How sure can we be that this will have the effect that we want to have? All right, and then weaponization of technology, just throwing that in there from an engineering perspective, certainly, you know, the machines can be used negatively. We see it with the large hacking networks coming out of Europe, frankly, out of Africa. There are many botnet networks, Asia, and certainly in the United States as well. So it's the weaponization of internet connectivity, of code, of things that were designed to better mankind, but that ultimately now could be used in a negative way. So how much do we trust technology? It's an interesting question, and that's a whole other webinar by itself. So final thoughts, how does really ethics relate to our personal and professional lives? And we're talking about this sort of engineering context. I think this is applicable throughout any context, frankly, but certainly from an engineering where people rely on the work that we do, whether it's cybersecurity work, whether it's actual steel engineering or fabrication, or whether it's maintaining the space shuttle, as I mentioned earlier, with the O-rings and things. Ethics is a system of principles. We talked about that at the beginning, discerning right from wrong, good from bad. Again, these are kind of subjective. It depends on your approach. But let's keep in mind that we make decisions. Ethics can give real and practical guidance to our lives. Certainly, we know that we try to be good, generally speaking, but sometimes decisions come up. Well, I don't know. Should I do this or should I do? There's questions, and hopefully we err on the side that we feel comports with our worldview about what we think about ourselves. I just threw a couple of slides in here. I'm not going to go into much detail, but what's the worldview, right? So a set of beliefs about your fundamental aspects of reality that ground and influence your perceptions, your thinking, your knowing and doing. And I kind of like this diagram here. The worldview, it's got the epistemology, metaphysics, cosmology. So again, how do you obtain knowledge? You know, what do you think about the origin of things? It kind of goes to like, where did we come from? You know, why are we here? Things like that. And this is an interesting thing here. We have our senses, the stimuli, we have our senses, and then we have how do we perceive that? So that's helping us to think. All right, so on my next slide here, I have a personal soft spot for George Kelly. Personal construct psychology was something that I studied while I was in college, and it always resonated with me from a personal standpoint. The people try to anticipate their own worlds by, you know, basically perceiving input in a way that makes sense to them. We have our own personal constructs. It's sort of a metaphysical thought about our world is based on our perception, and you know, someone else's world based on the same type of raw input may be different. It may be interestingly different based on their personal constructs. When we talk about constructs, we talk about these perceived opposites. Happy, what I think is happy is because of what I can construe as what's sad. Okay, so it's sort of like this contrast and compare. But I bring this up only because from an ethical dilemma, what's good, what's bad? Well, this is a good outcome if I make this choice. This is a bad outcome, and I know bad because it feels wrong. See, you can see this subjective type approach. Back to the virtue ethics, good people do good things, right? This is where, you know, this is why two people can make different decisions with the same knowledge, the same input. So when we're talking about dealing with regulatory compliance, we're talking about communication to executive boards, we need to try to be as objective and on a level playing field with the same definitions and terminology and goals as the other folks that we're speaking to. Otherwise, it could shift based on our personal construct of what it means, or based on our, if we have a justification motive where we're trying to say, well, I didn't really want to talk about that because that makes me look bad or the team look bad. And now, well, it'll just pass. So there's decisions there. Let's see. Ultimately, practical ethics in these fields, it's ultimately about the choices we make, practically speaking. I mean, there's historical and classical literature filling books with ethical dilemmas, the Nicomachean ethics and Aristotle and all that. But day to day, the choices we make, the choices that we make do have consequences for ourselves and for the others that we deal with, whether it's our company or friends or family. And we have to have professional and at least personal responsibility to some degree for the actions that we take. And you're going to be called to the mat to defend a decision if something results in, say, a HIPAA violation that they can prove was based, it was a decision, a breach happened, even though you had knowledge that something was being done or not being done. Now you have accountability for that. You have to speak to that. Practical ethics. This is something that we really need to consider as we move forward in the professional world. So I think that's all I had for today. I know I filled a lot of time with a lot of slides, but Azita, I think I've presented. I can take any questions if anything's come up.
Absolutely. So if at the audience, if you have any questions, please go ahead and put them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. I actually have a question as we wait for questions to come in. I have a question. I know you talked about two companies that, we talk about, at least in my classes, we talk about quite a bit, the SEC issue and the other, Wells Fargo issue. The one that comes to mind when we're talking about some cybersecurity and privacy and such is the one that we talk about quite a bit, which is the Equifax breach, data breach. And you think about the various stakeholders, and me being sort of the customer, the consumer, didn't really have a choice in terms of deciding to go with Equifax as opposed to another company. There are these three institutions, and they all get my information. Yeah. And in the case of Equifax, it was as simple as they sent, one of these companies, the auditors or such, sent the information and said, go ahead and patch this. And Equifax didn't. And so now my data is out there. And of course, the company comes back and says, well, we'll protect you through some means for about a year. But I know well enough that my information isn't going to get, used within that year. It's going to happen 10 years down the road. Then you look at Equifax, and Equifax doesn't necessarily go away, doesn't become bankrupt. And just like any other company, there's a slap on the back of the hand, and, that we're pretty much back where we were. I guess my question to you is twofold. One, as a consumer, as the person whose information is now out there and has been exposed, what rights do I have? And second, what happens to the employees at this company when now they haven't done what they're supposed to do? And there are other people who weren't involved in this project, but now whose name has been tarnished as a result of this mistake. So in the next job that they go to apply, they say, oh, you worked for Equifax. Well, we know what happened to Equifax. So I guess the question at the heart of it is about stakeholders and how stakeholders, and you talked about communication. How do we get these different entities, these different cultures to communicate with each other? And how do we protect the end user or the end consumer?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first of all, I just want to address the consumer action, the private right of action, so to speak. This is an issue that varies based on state. States will grant essentially, I mean, it could be a federal statute, but there is no unifying privacy statute in the United States at this point. We talk about HIPAA, and those are large-scale privacy statutes, but they only apply to a specific type of data, and they don't essentially grant a private right of action to an individual like yourself, if your information was breached, you would essentially need to go through the attorney general of your state, generally speaking. There are some states that do allow private rights of action, based on the type of information that's been leaked, based on the damage that you can show. Typically, for any kind of lawsuit, you need to show some sort of injury. Okay, you need to be able to demonstrate that beyond the fact that it was exposed. Sometimes it's considered sufficient injury to show that it's been disclosed in an uncontrolled or unauthorized way. I hate to have to say that it depends on state and it depends on the statute and the type of data, but sadly in the United States right now, that's the way it is. So from a private right of action, trying to actually get, some sort of compensation in a sense. Remember, the law is civil law mostly deals with economic, restitution in some way. Criminal law is mostly going to deal with either fines or incarceration, loss of freedom. There are some criminal repercussions for large-scale breaches. There's no question. And it would be the people that create the governance or leadership umbrella over these types of companies like Equifax that set the tone, that provide the ethical code, that need to check for compliance. So they could actually have criminal repercussions on that. Okay, so that's the issue there in terms of the private right of action. In terms of the company itself, a company like Enron, they made ethical choices. They absconded with funds. They obviously went out of business. It was so dramatic. So they took it essentially to the point of dissolving the company, which has its own repercussions. Of course, loss of jobs, things like that. I believe there were criminal repercussions with Enron as well for the top executives. By being just associated with the company doesn't necessarily, I think, blacklist anybody, depending on the type of decision that they were capable of making or authorized to make. It's that old question again, was I just following orders, or was I creating the order? If I'm just doing what I'm told, well, I kind of want to keep my job. I do think, though, that you have ethical questions to answer yourself. If somebody's telling me to hide something or not be transparent or not communicate to a certain stakeholder, I think I share some of the accountability. And I think that if you could show damage or injury occurred because of that, then yeah, I believe that there would be some sort of repercussion. From a regulatory standpoint, it could have to do with being able to ever take a job that involves trust again. So for instance, if you're an attorney and you get caught in a crime of trust, like tax fraud, something like that, a lot of times they'll take your license because you're demonstrating that you can't be trusted when people aren't watching. That's not a favorable position for anybody. So they'll take your license. You may be able to get it back, but you've got to appeal. You've got to take training. They're trying to rehabilitate you if they can, generally speaking. But then you had people like Bernie Madoff. He stole millions and millions and millions of dollars. Ponzi scheme beyond compare. He was just done. They yanked his license to trade, and of course there was criminal action there. So
Yeah.
I do want to get into this concept though quick about informed consent. And this is where when we allow people to use our data, and with Equifax, they were basically a large CRA or a consumer reporting agency. Yeah, do we know what we're agreeing to when we click that box that says, yes, you can share based on this 50-page, disclosure of use of information? That's where it gets a little shaky.
Awesome. Now, I do have other questions, but I want to read some of the audience questions. James asks, for lawyers advising client on these issues, what is the hierarchy of best certification for lawyers to pursue to support their clients? That is CISSP better than CIPP. And a follow-up to that, is there a certification out there that attorneys can pursue to demonstrate a fluency with ethical use of AI?
Well, first of all, I would say from an attorney's perspective, the IAP CIPP would be the better way to go at this point. That's more of a privacy statute, and that's more how you'll be working with clients. You can't do everything, right? So I happen to have a wide background in IT, and then I went into law. So I've got that just sort of built in from my years of experience. But the CIPP, you can do US regulatory law, you can do Europe, you can do APEC. They do have different specialties. That'll give you a great sense of the type of concerns we have around protecting private information, personal information. And as an attorney, that would be, I think, more useful than the CISSP, which is going to be much deeper into cybersecurity and IT, which may not have as much use to you. As far as AI certifications, there are a couple of things that are out there now. Companies, certifying companies are trying to actually build those elements into their existing certifications. But there are also a wide variety of graduate certificates now that you can work toward that specialize in those areas. Like I said, Albany Law, I was part of their graduate studies, online graduate studies, frankly, async type studies that you could do on your time as a working individual. That will specialize or focus on those types of approaches and industry standards, given that it's changing dynamically, it would be at this point in time. So not sure there's a specific certification I'd recommend for AI. I would look at a wide range of things, including existing certifications, and see how they've addressed AI, and then maybe some of those graduate programs. Those are certificate programs usually. A lot of times anywhere from 15 to 20 credits, and you could get a certification, so to speak, from an educational institution that would address some of those concerns.
Awesome.
Okay.
Thank you so much. We are just a little bit over time at this point. So I want to thank you. I'd love to bring you back and ask you a few more deep dive questions at some point. But
Sure.
I want to thank you so much for sharing your time with us and your knowledge. I also want to thank the OEC's director, Dr. Rosalind Byrne, who was actually with us just earlier, and our coordinator, Tracy Marshall, whose picture you see, and she's making sure that we stay alive while we're on here for the hour. And to all of you for joining us today. So thank you so much for being here, and we hope that you've enjoyed this talk today. Thank you. Have a great day and a wonderful weekend. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you. Bye-bye.